Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly town hall caring for the caregiver. You may notice if you've been in our previous sessions, I am not Wendy Cadge. I am Michael Skaggs, the executive director of the lab, and I'm here with you today. Very happy to be so. Wendy has another commitment, so I am stepping in. But more importantly, we are joined this afternoon by Su Yon Pak, who is senior director and associate professor of integrative and field-based education at Union Theological Seminary. And Su Yon is involved in a number of things that are connected to the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, so it was an easy ask for her to be here. So thank you for being generous with your time and your wisdom. For those of you who have been to these in weeks past, the format will follow something very similar. And for those of you who haven't, if this is your first time, this is intended to be, it's right there in the name. It is a town hall. We have someone who comes and talks a little bit about things that they are a specialist or expertise in, but really this is a time for you to talk about what you are seeing, experiencing, what your needs are. You can exchange ideas, that kind of thing, because we know this is it's a stressful time, but very intentionally, this is not necessarily meant to be something where you have to, take copious close notes or remember everything that Su Yon says. You can relax a little bit and take advantage of Su Yon's wisdom. So with that, Su Yon, I will turn it over to you, and then I will pop back up towards the end.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, all of you, for inviting me to this conversation for the Town Hall, Caring for the Caregivers. And I want to begin by recognizing all the caregivers out there, many of you who work tirelessly with little or no recognition. And some of you may be in a paid profession of caregiving, maybe chaplains, healthcare workers, home health aides, childcare teachers, long-term care facility workers. And some of you are caregiving because your family, friends, community members need care. And many of you are doing both. Caring is demanding work during ordinary times, but during this pandemic, it's an extraordinary work. It is work that embraces dignity and love. So, thank you. For our session today, I've been asked to speak about racial justice and spiritual care during these times. And we've been so painfully made aware that the fault lines of inequalities in our society have become even more prominent during this crisis. While the virus does not seem to discriminate, marginalized communities disproportionately suffer due to lack of access to healthcare, food insecurity, and an inability to shelter in place because how people live and work. This constant weathering from discrimination makes communities of color more susceptible to the virus and are more likely to die from it. As an Asian American woman, I've been experiencing another form of weathering that has been on the rise in the last several months. It's anti-Asian violence. It's a particular kind of violence that makes you feel like a stranger in your own home, a perpetual foreigner in this country. To speak personally, I was surprised to admit that after almost 50 years of being in this country, having navigated and resisted racism in its many forms, that I should find myself being afraid to go out, to take a walk by myself, or to go to the grocery store. This fear is not only of the COVID-19 viral contagion. It's the fear of contagion of hatred directed at Asian Americans. I have become keenly sensitive to my surroundings, bracing myself for a Kung flu or Chinese virus epithet, or even physical harm that so many Asian Americans and in particular, Asian American women have been subjected to. Daily activities that I did without thinking is now something I need to fear and protect myself against. But this is not new, right? There is a long history of anti-Asian sentiments in this country. We were seen as the yellow peril or the stranger danger. Just to name a few historical markers, in 1882, Chinese were excluded from coming into this country because of xenophobic fear that the East Asian race will stain the morals of white Americans. During World War II, innocent Japanese Americans were rounded up and incarcerated in internment camps. And after 9/11, South Asian Americans were targeted as terrorists and suffered violence and discrimination. And now, during this pandemic, a new strain of the yellow peril narrative rears its ugly head as more Asian Americans are scapegoated, attacked, and terrorized. An organization called the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council began collecting incidents of hate crimes since March. And it received about 1,500 reports just in 1 month. And we know that many incidents go unreported, so this number does not adequately reflect the reality. An analysis of the reported incidents show that the high proportion of vulnerable Asian populations, namely children, youth, elderly, and limited English-speaking people, are being targeted. Women are harassed 2.3 times more than men. And incidents range from verbal attacks to being refused service at a business or barred from transportation to physical assaults. Acid was thrown on a Korean woman while putting out her trash in Brooklyn, New York. And a Burmese man and his 2 sons were stabbed inside Sam's Club in Midland, Texas. In fact, the New York City Human Rights Commission formed anti-Asian coronavirus task force to monitor and respond to the growing number of hate crimes against Asians in New York City. This kind of hate or fear of violence impacts not only our emotional and physical being, but also our spiritual being. It interferes with our ability to find connections, make meaning, and activate hope. And many suffer in silence because this kind of violence engenders shame. For me, it brings me right back to my 10-year-old self, who, as a new immigrant with very little English, was racially harassed daily by my classmates in the playground. Shame comes up like bitter bile. It makes us feel, on the one hand, hyper visible, and on the other hand, hyper invisible. We resist this hatred and begin our healing by telling our stories. Through storytelling, we take back our agency, spiritual wholeness, and our humanity. So, what should we do? Well, I have 2 suggestions. First, listen. Listen. And here, chaplains are uniquely skilled to partner in this healing and resisting. Being seen and being heard is an essential part of this process. Careful listening, the one that hears another to speech, to quote Nell Morton, is what is needed. With openness and vulnerability to suspend previously held assumptions about Asian Americans and just listen to see us for who we are, not the model minority or the yellow peril stereotypes of who we are made out to be. Listening. And listen not only for what's been done to us by this hatred, but what we are doing to resist and even thrive in the midst of it. Whether you're providing care for Asian clients, or you're supporting your Asian colleagues, neighbors, and friends, deep listening to these stories of fear, anxiety, anger, and resilience begins the justice work of healing. And even if you have very little contact with Asians in your daily life and your work, because there are few Asians in your area, please know that the few Asians who remain invisible will feel even more isolated. It is important that you listen. And for those of you who are of Asian descent, tell your stories. Support one another by uttering the unutterable. By voicing our experiences, we can quell the power that shame has over us, and report your incidents. Second, advocate. Whether you are providing spiritual care in a hospital, nursing home, prison, or educational institutions, advocate. Having listened to the experiences of Asian Americans, what might you advocate for? Without making assumptions about what we need that takes away our agency, you might ask us what we need. Is it to take experiences of anti-Asian violence seriously? Is it language facilitation? Is it working to shift the historical and current narrative of anti-Asian sentiments in your organization, your family, or your community? Is it inviting others to learn more about the work of organizations who are combating this locally or nationally? Advocate. While I'm focusing on anti-Asian violence that has dramatically intensified during this pandemic, we need to remember that advocacy needs to be done intersectionally and in solidarity with other minoritized groups. Oppressive systems have a way of pitting one group against another. So even as I speak of the rise of anti-Asian violence, I put that in the history and the context of the genocide and ongoing violence done to Native American, African American, and Latinx communities in this country, the latest form of which is showing up during this COVID-19 crisis. So we all need to be working together to combat this. So I want to stop here and to allow for some conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Su Yon. And this is you've covered so much territory in this that I think it's a really good reminder of just how what is happening right now with the coronavirus is not just, it's not a biological problem that will be solved and go away. It encompasses so much more than that. So thank you for bringing this to our attention and helping us understand really the breadth of what we are experiencing. So I want to remind everyone about the Q&A function. So please do put questions that you may have in there, or even just comments. I have thoughts of my own, but of course this is open to you. So please put things in there as well. I want to latch on to one of the very first things you said, which is that care during the pandemic is extraordinary care. And on one level, that's obvious. I mean, we're all under enormous amounts of pressure. So to even provide spiritual care is a real act of giving. But what is qualitatively different about spiritual care right now than 6 months ago?
Wow, the qualitatively different. That's a really good question. And I think, I mean, speak to chaplains might be able to tell you more in terms of qualitatively whether they sense that the shift is different. I think for me, the way I see it is that uh, because of the sort of the waves of crisis that are coming, so many deaths, so many illnesses, and so much need. There is no like a usual cycle of downturn where we can breathe, right? So and it's compounding on top of the other. So whether it's not having appropriate safety the equipments, or
Right.
whether it's having enough people to provide the care that used to be cared for by whole number, a lot more people. Whether it's different way of providing care, right? So I've heard from chaplains. In fact, one of the chaplains I was speaking to this week said that she is struggling with what it means to, her theology around chaplaincy was around incarnation,
Hmm.
which is to be infleshed and embodied. And how does that work when we cannot be physically present?
Right.
So I think it's the strain, the stressors are the rapidity of engagement with lack of resources, and I think a different way of connecting, which I think we're all trying to figure out how to do spiritual care on the phone, on video chats, and other ways. But chaplains who are so used to doing in person, being present, um, I think that's a different qualitative way of connecting.
Well, and that leads to a question that we got immediately that touches on this issue of not being physically present. Although it's not direct spiritual care, but uh, this guest says, how might one advocate from a virtual and isolated setting? That was one of your action points of advocating for people who are experiencing even greater degrees of discrimination right now. How do you do that when most of us are like you and me, sitting at the dining room table or in the basement doing their work? how can we be effective advocates in this really weird setting?
Yeah, I think it's not that different than how one would provide pastoral and spiritual care. How would we do that sitting in a basement? We make calls. I mean, there are a lot of statements out there that we're looking for signatories on. There are organizations working to bring this to light in terms of the lawmakers and our elected officials to raise consciousness around this, right? And also advocacy also means you hear things. You're in a conversation with friends and community members, and they say things. Then you say, excuse me, I actually that's not okay, or that's not the history of it, or that is not the way we should talk about this. Or I mean, there are ways of advocating that you don't have to physically be out there connecting in a particular way.
Yeah. Uh, Another follow up on that, and I think that all of us have questions in so many ways of how do we do just normal things in our lives
Hmm.
in this new way, or a temporary normal or whatever. But this is a great question. How is listening different when you have to do it via Zoom or on the phone? How can we listen well when we can't see the person? I think a lot of times we don't associate those things with being so closely related, but if I can't see, I can't smell cologne or perfume or hear them breathing, we're just like this. How do you listen well on the phone?
Yeah, I think that's we have become such visual culture, whether it's media, even Zoom,
Yeah,
right? That I think we've lost the art of tuning our ears. And in a certain sense, like spiritual practices um, that focus on hearing and listening, that is not, visual, can help us. And I think we have to practice that because we so easily have jumped over to the visual way of being or seeing to get our cues.
right.
So I think it's challenged because we're a little bit rusty at it. but this is a chance and opportunity to really tune up that radio dial,
Yeah.
and in a literally the tuning in a way that we're attuned to hearing the voice inflections, the shaking of the breaking of the sound, the breath or the lack of breath or the holding of the breath that we can hear, right? So that's the work we can do in our own spiritual practices as well as in our care for others.
Well, and what you just said reminded me that so many things that we, and by I'm not a chaplain, so I can't speak for chaplains, but so many things that we think that we're good at or that we have kind of down pat, then when something like this happens and you realize, wait a minute, what actually do I not know? There's this great question that I think is a wonderful reminder for all of us. I know our audience fairly well, and I think that most of us understand that we live in a society that is built on a history of racism and oppression. No matter what you think about it, that's the past. And we might think that we are sort of enlightened and we get it, and and we do the right thing. But this person who unfortunately had to leave said, what are some examples of specific behaviors or things that we can address? And we talked about this before we got on, of if you live in a community like me where there aren't many Asian Americans who aren't experiencing this, we're apt to just not notice. What things should we be looking for that we might think in our enlightenment, we've got taken care of, but actually is happening right under our nose?
So let's say going to a grocery store, right? And the 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 challenge, the difficult thing about this kind of racism that you don't quite know what is being done or said to you, and you're always second guessing yourself. So so you're in a grocery store, and someone says you can't have this cart. I mean, this actually happened. Somebody had a cart, and somebody said, "You're Asian. You're not allowed to have a cart." And so they wouldn't um, let this person have the grocery cart. Right. So most people wouldn't think, just even think about, oh, it's whatever, but attuning to this day and this time, might there be something else going on there, right?
Right.
It's around us. So it's, we don't have to do extraordinary work of, marching down the, having a protest march. I think it's in our everyday little things that we could do to advocate, even paying attention to what happens when you're standing in line.
Yeah.
Because when things come at me, so for example, this is just at the beginning, I think March, I was on the subway, and it wasn't a very crowded subway, but I walked in, and this person who was sitting there immediately withdrew, pulled all her belongings, and pulled her thing up like this. There were other people who came in, but when she saw me, she just kind of, pulled herself away from me as much as she could. So I thought, so I was shocked. I mean, for me, it was like, but did anyone notice? Did anyone else notice it, or was it just me?
Right.
Right. So I think by awareness, like if you know this is happening, then you might actually pay more attention and be more attuned to things that are going on that you might not have been able to see before,
Right.
because it is happening, and people are feeling the anxiety and fear around that too. So
Well, and if anything, I would speculate that maybe we will see an even greater incidence of this as we begin to be able to go out in public more. That's more numbers of interactions,
right.
more opportunities for both really gracious interactions and really ungracious interactions as well. Um, you know, things like that, like what you just said about denying someone a shopping cart because they're Asian. There was somewhere else in Indiana that I can't remember, but very early on, an Asian person tried to get a hotel room, and the hotel owner physically detained them and said, I'm supposed to arrest you because you're Asian. I mean, just mind-bogglingly stupid things. Those are so obvious. But if I'm a chaplain in a hospital and I have an Asian patient, in theory, the opportunities for racist conduct should be much lower in a hospital. But what types of considerations should chaplains be giving to provide spiritual care for Asians or Asian Americans that are in their settings? Are there certain, should something be on their mind as they're trying to do this?
So, I mean, as I said, I can't speak for all Asians. So, as I said, we're such a diverse group of people. So, I think just asking them, asking each, what they need,
Sure.
and being really attuned to, you know, in this time, and if in this time when such kind of the culture and the temperature of this violence against Asians are permeating, and whether it's being struck out or whether it's right under the surface, it's like we're breathing this stuff. So, like, how are they feeling? I mean, you don't have to kind of approach and say, well, I understand this is happening, so are you feeling threatened? I mean, but just have like being attuned to what the person may or may not be feeling, and they actually may not be aware at all. But
Right.
even things like, nurses that Asian nurses who patients don't want to be cared for by,
Mhm.
and doctors that they don't want, because they're afraid of contracting. I mean, so how would chaplains, work with them? What would they do? I mean, I think that's um, sort of in a everyday life of a chaplain, right? That kind of work, but it's uh, we're looking at a specific moment in time where certain um, interactions are heightened like that. But so yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything specific or even general I would say, other than um, just being attentive to the the cultural, the temperature, the kind of feeling of anti-Asian things that are going on in our media, um, from our public officials and all that. And so I think just being attentive to how that might contribute to people's well-being
Yeah.
might be a question that chaplain might be asking themselves.
I think this is a really nice reminder that even while chaplains are thinking more and more and more about staff care, that's the phrase, and especially in a healthcare setting, the most immediate pressure is just the crush of people and trying to take care of so many people and having this threat of illness, among staff themselves. And it's just from a really overt physical stance. How do we care for staff who are just being pushed to the absolute limit every day? That threatens to push out of sight the whole personhood of every staff member. You
Mm.
just mentioned, someone might see an Asian nurse or doctor and say, no, I want someone else. That's an enormous pressure as well. Not to, sort of pile on to what chaplains should be thinking of, but, the coronavirus issue is not the only thing that people still have on their minds.
Right.
Uh, Staff have a lot of other concerns as well. Or even if it has to do with the virus, it's not just am I going to get sick or I'm exhausted or whatever, but a patient just turned me away or whatever. That's a whole other level of difficulty that staff are experiencing right now beyond just being pushed to the absolute limit. Um, this next question, I think, is something that we all probably think about a lot, whether we want to admit it or not. But I would be interested in your take. Um, when the COVID situation is resolved, and I would interject whenever that may be, what do you think now is going to become part of our new normal? What should we take out of this
Mm.
and carry with us beyond?
If there is a silver lining, and if there is, that's a big if. I think uh, the communal values that we were forced to inhabit and practice. This is not just about my own safety and what I want to do, but how my action impacts, uh, a whole lot of other people, right? So I think I'm hoping that that whole care for the community, putting not always putting myself first, but thinking about the communal aspect of living together, working together, what it means to be in a society together.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that that would be a value that will consistently go forth
Sure.
as we rebuild from this. So that's one thing. I mean, I've been struck by how we have shown care, communally and otherwise, through this, and we have it in us. We have it. We could do it. So I'm sort of reminded, and I'm encouraged by that. So I'm hoping that that will be an important value that goes through. The other thing is almost forced on us, and I teach in an education institution where we had to pivot very quickly from in-person education to online, right?
Yeah.
It took a lot of creativity and ingenuity, and I'm not sure that we have necessarily succeeded, but we're trying to meet the goals that we have set as educational goals for the semester, for the course, and how that can be translated when we went online or to a different format. And I have to say, we're not going to 100% or maybe even 80% and hopefully maybe 50%. But what's become clear from this is that we became a lot more articulate and clear about what really matters to us.
Right.
Those things, that extraneous things that we thought were important or were necessary part of our lives, we really found out that not really. That's not really that important. There are other things that are important. So I'm hoping that going forward, when we rebuild from this, that we remember the time during this crisis, what we said was the core. What was the real mission in terms of people? What really is my vocation? What really matters to me? And I would also encourage us to write it down so we do not forget that once we get over this, that we're all back to doing what if it could be normal. I don't know if it could ever be back to where we were, but using this time to really drilling down for all of us to articulate and to come back to the core and what really matters. And I'm hoping, excuse me, that going forth, that both the communal values and knowing what really matters to us will help rebuild what we need to do going forward in the future.
Well, and what strikes me is that in some ways, this forced reanalysis of our priorities and what is important, I would hope, including myself, I would hope that this prevents us from doing what we used to do, which is give lip service to those things, but not actually follow through. A lot of us we miss the fact that we cannot see the people that we love and want to be with. And even if before we said, well, I need to make more time for family or whatever, and you would kind of nod in that direction and then just, carry on like normal. I would hope that this, everything being thrown into relief like this, sort of sticks with us moving forward. This is a really great question that has to do with both the common good and trying to take lessons away from this. This person says, I'm wondering if there might be a lot of frustrated chaplains and spiritual care providers who have been furloughed or laid off or whatever, and they might feel helpless because they can't provide care. What should those chaplains be doing right now? And I know some of these people, they're going absolutely crazy because, they are built to help people and now they can't. Ideas?
That's a great question. Well, I don't know.
And anyone else in the audience, please chime
Yeah.
in through chat or the question box. I mean, this is a huge question, and I think it goes beyond chaplains as well. Lots of people were finding themselves, out of work or underemployed or whatever, and the question of purpose and meaning is elusive to lots of folks right now.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, so I think there are two aspects if we do sort of like the yin and the yang of our being, right? The yang is the active, expressive piece, and the yin is more internal, reflective piece. And I wonder, even as we're even as we are asked to be so active, right, to provide care, to respond to the crisis in this immediate triage. If we're looking at the collective chaplains as a whole, that the group of them that are working so hard, and then the group who would like to work maybe unable to, I'm wondering, I'm just thinking out loud, whether they take on the reflective piece, the contemplative piece, the spiritual support for the chaplains piece, right? So who cares for the caregivers? This is the chaplain forum. What if they care for the caregivers? Are there ways that they could connect to chaplains? And I'm wondering if this is a Chaplaincy Innovation Lab project of, getting those people who really like to be caring for those who need care, for them to be caring for chaplains who are absolutely burned out at this point or stretched too thin. So that's one thing I'm thinking about, that whether as a whole corpus, the whole body, the active and the reflective piece can be there together.
There's even this nice comment here of chaplains who are experiencing some degree of what you could think of as survivor's guilt for keeping your job when other people, maybe direct colleagues have been furloughed or just outright terminated or whatever. That's a consideration as well. I know, and I say it all the time, I'm not a chaplain, so I can't engage the theory and the depth of it. But I try to remind myself that the stresses that I feel, whatever guilt or anything like that I feel, none of us are alone in this. We're not alone in the overall struggle with the coronavirus, but just in the difficulty that everybody has. Very few people have the luxury of being immune from all of this. And so even if we can't be together to experience it, we are still together in some way. Let me take a moment to read some of these comments, because I said, give us some ideas. So I want to give voice to them. Volunteer. That's certainly something that you can do. Maybe even a spiritual care capacity. ACPE has set up a volunteer collector form to do telechaplaincy for places that are especially hard hit. So you could certainly do that. And there are plenty of other ways to volunteer as well. I know for a fact that if there is a particular interest or cause that you have, there are lots of things that you can do online to volunteer that don't require being in person. There are just so many things that can be done in that way. So that's certainly an excellent way to stay active at this time. Start with family and then work outwards from there in terms of outreach and checking on people. I think that has to do with things that we can carry forward beyond this present crisis. Of course, we should be calling people who are isolated and checking up on them. There's no reason we shouldn't do that in the future as well once this is all done. So thank you for that. What else do we have here? Appreciation for the calling, recognizing the value of the profession and the role that is played with others, and trying to keep in mind that it most frequently is a business decision and not a personal dismissal of the chaplain. And if you're maybe if you're in a nonprofit setting, business decision sounds wrong, but just outright viability. Sometimes this is a necessity. There's the ACPE volunteer opportunity again, so that's great. Let's see what else. There are so many coming in. I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep track of them. You can pray for communities who are focused on the economy and not people. Help at local churches and call those who might have no one calling or checking in with them. Social isolation was a problem before now. Involuntary social isolation, that certainly has not gotten any better now. Whether working for pay or not, I find us chaplains being good dialogue partners for each other as we struggle to do new things in a new way. That's certainly wonderful as well. Which reminds me, the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab has a Facebook group that you can all join and talk with each other as well, more directly there. Even before all this started, I was a little wary of social media and the addictive effect it has on our lives. But if anything, now it's a way to stay connected. So I would certainly encourage you to check that out as well. What else? As a chaplain intern, I am not allowed to work in a clinical setting anymore. I have found opportunities to serve by volunteering as a chaplain to the local police and fire department via phone and email connection. And I also call the nurses as they have their beginning of shift huddles. So working in a volunteer capacity there as well. This can be a good time for additional education via videos, including via the lab. Thank you, that's a wonderful mention. And in some places, there is a need for volunteers to counsel via phone lines as well. Wonderful ideas. Organizations that usually have chaplains are arranging for telechaplains, prisons, 24/7 care facilities, nursing homes, etc. I do know that prisons are an especially difficult environment for chaplaincy right now. Communication in and out of a prison is almost impossible in normal circumstances, much less now. So that is something that the chaplains should keep in mind as well. As a chaplain, we never stop caring. I think that's
true.
That's really, really good. In difficult situations like this, it can be really, really bad as well. All right, let me get maybe just a couple of more here. These are coming in fast and furious, so thank you all
That's
very
great.
much. Reaching out to the families of the COVID patients is so important, and this is a good reminder. Families are being very hard hit right now, especially for those who are experiencing death and grieving from a distance. It's not just a plug, but we did an entire webinar on distance grieving and what does it mean when you can't have a physical funeral. And this is just an ongoing question that we're going to be dealing with for quite some time as well. Maybe I'll finish up with this question that brings it right back to you, Su Yon, and that's how is the Union Seminary community being impacted emotionally by being in an epicenter? So how has Union responded? I mean, every educational institution has, more or less shut down, but Union is right there in the middle of all of it. So how has it affected you there?
Well, it's like you say, it's an epicenter, and so there's a lot more precaution being taken. I have to say that we are still continuing to finish out the semester, and we had to go from in person to online education, and we had to pivot very quickly to moving everything online and having to move students. Not all, some are still in the residence hall, so moving out so that we have enough social distancing in the dorm rooms and residencies. So if should anything happen, that there's a plan for that, right? So I think it's fair to say that grief and mourning is a prominent emotion right now. It's also fair to say, I know at least among my students who, particularly the one that had to leave and find a home somewhere else, whether they went back home or whether they're staying with their friends or they're staying with family, or some who have a hard time finding some place to stay. Some of them, this like the triage feeling of having to immediately respond to this catastrophic loss in many ways, right? At the same time, they're like holding their breath and unable to really mourn and breathe out, because as if holding your breath, you could prevent the other shoe from dropping, whatever that shoe might be. So I think we're doing our best to support. We went from regular grade to pass fail if that's what they needed, and the other kinds of leniency and extensions and and changing of the assignments and all that, just to alleviate some of the stress. But I would say that it will take some time for us to even say and recognize that we need to mourn and grieve. While that's there, not everyone has given themselves permission to do that.
Right.
So I would imagine that would be a long work of healing for our students and for our staff and our faculty, to say it's okay now to breathe out and grieve and mourn what's been lost and who's been lost to us, right? So yeah, I mean, that's with all the other things that need to be done to, I'm just thinking about all the administrative work that has to be done, that's being done. But in terms of, like, if I was to say where people are, resilient, and I'm afraid that it's going to be a long haul of healing and mourning and grieving from this.
Yeah. I think that when I look back before the world really changed, what stands out to me is this sense of complacency that I think most of us just move through life with. We were so unprepared to have to work from home. Mm-hmm. We were so unprepared to have to do online education. There are so much smaller events that could have happened to force us to go do those things, and we weren't even prepared for that, much less to be forced into our homes for months and months. So I would hope that coming out of this, that sense of complacency maybe recedes a little bit, and we become a little more reflective of what we are experiencing, what we have experienced. That process of grieving and mourning is going to be a long one, not least because everyone experiences it in different stages. But I would hope that that it is something that we do attend to in our institutions, in our organizations, and make space for that to happen once we can begin to move into a new normal that maybe isn't quite as fraught as right now. I don't want to short anybody by not including your comments, but we have so many of them here that I think you probably don't want to watch me read them out. So what I will do is we can take all of these and we'll put them on the website. It'll be right under this recording. If any of you have watched any of the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab webinars that are recorded, they've got the video right there, and then any resources that are associated with that webinar are right under it. So I'll include all of this there. Again, use the Facebook group. That's a wonderful place to interact. And let us know what we could be doing better or what we're not doing or whatever. We've heard gratitude for all that we're doing, and we've heard also chaplains are inundated with resources. What do we do when we have so many things at our disposal that we don't know where to begin? And all I can say is let us know. We are here for chaplains. We're here for you, but we don't know what you need unless you tell us. So please do that. Again, this is recorded, so if you came in late, no worries. You'll get a link to that. We'll mail it out. You can always watch these after the fact. Su Yon, thank you so much for your time. I remind everyone at the end of the webinars that whoever our guest is, they're experiencing it just like everybody else. And so it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort and energy to do this. So thank you very much for being with us today, Su Yon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone, keep an eye on chaplaincyinnovation.org. That's where all our webinar schedules are. You get those in the newsletter every week as well, so keep an eye out for future events, and we will see you there. Thank you all. Bye-bye.